Hello everyone, today we are going to frost a semi-naked cake. It is elegant enough to be served just like this, or it can be used as a canvas for other cake decorating techniques, such as the drip cake that I have pictured here from another tutorial. I will show you this semi-naked frosting technique using my German chocolate cake, which has 3 layers of chocolate cake, Swiss meringue buttercream, and coconut pecan filling. So the first important thing when stacking any kind of layer cake, and especially a semi-naked cake, is to ensure that your cake is frozen. The first reason being, in general, frozen cake is just going to be easier for you to stack. And the second reason you want it to be frozen with semi-naked or naked cakes is because it gives off less crumbs. We're going to be using less frosting for the crumb coat. We don't want too many crumbs coming off. The first thing that I'm doing here with the mostly frozen cake, and I say mostly frozen because if it were completely frozen, I wouldn't be able to cut it off. So pretty firm, not all the way frozen, but I'm leveling the tops, and I like my cake layers to be about 1 inch thick. And just for reference, this is a 6-inch in diameter cake. Now, if you enjoy learning from cake tutorials like this, go ahead and join me by subscribing, because I put out all kinds of information in my videos about decorating and baking. Now, once you have properly leveled all of your cakes, it's a good idea before you start frosting to kind of determine the order and the orientation of the cake layers. So typically I like to work with the flattest part exposed so that when you frost it, it just gives you a more level surface. So I'll often put the bottom of, or the cake that was exposed to the bottom of the cake pan, at the very top of the cake, because that gives you a really flat surface. Now here I just have my 8-inch cake board and then the little piece of sticky cabinet liner so that the cake doesn't slide around. And we're going to go ahead and put the first layer on by smearing some frosting on the bottom to stick it to the cake board. Then take your first layer of cake and center it on the cake board. Now I'm going to use a piping bag to fill my cake, and what I'm doing is creating a dam because I'm making a German chocolate cake which is filled with coconut and pecan filling, which is typically a little bit runny, and I don't want that on the outside of my cake. So by piping around the perimeter of the cake like this, I prevent any of the filling from spilling out. However, if you're just doing a straight up frosting filling, you can pipe a spiral and then use a spatula to flatten it out, or you can just use a spatula and scoop some filling or frosting on and then smooth it out that way. So now I'm just going to pile in the coconut pecan filling and then smooth that out. So this technique is ideal for any type of filling that is really runny. So if you make a lemon curd cake or a cake with jam or anything like that, this is a great way to keep the filling inside and keep the exterior of the cake looking really clean. Okay, then just place on your second layer of cake and repeat that entire process. Now we're going to do the crumb coat, so take your piping bag or your spatula and start to apply some frosting to the exposed parts of the cake. The purpose of the crumb coat is to lock in the crumbs. Typically that's what people think, but it really does serve 2 functions. It acts as a protective barrier for the cake, and I kind of think of it as like buttering a piece of bread. So when you put the butter on the bread, or we're applying buttercream on the outside of the cake, it prevents any moisture from leaving the cake, so it prevents the cake from drying out, but it also prevents any crumbs from escaping the cake into the outer layer. So it just acts as this all-purpose protective barrier for your cake. Once you've put enough frosting that you think will cover the entire of the cake very thinly, take an offset spatula and start smoothing off the top of the cake. Some people like to start with the sides, so start with whatever you're comfortable with and just start spreading the frosting. And it doesn't have to be neat because we're going to do a second layer, but you just want a thin coating over every exposed area of the cake. Once you're done with the top, then start working on the sides with a long flat spatula. And what I like to do first is kind of fill in any gaps or kind of spackle the holes. So if there are gaps in the layers, in between the layers in particular, make sure that there is enough frosting, because that's going to create the smooth side. So first I like to go around the entire cake and ensure that all of the in between the layers is filled. And once you get to a point where your cake is completely covered in frosting, that's when you're going to want to grab your bench scraper to start taking off frosting. So working with a bench scraper does take a little bit of practice, but just remember that it has two functions. The first one being to scrape frosting off, and the second function being to smooth the frosting. Now this will depend on the type of cake that you're making, but ideally for crumb coats, the first time you go around with the bench scraper, for me, it's probably about 80% scraping off frosting and about 20% of smoothing. The difference between scraping and smoothing is going to be totally dependent on the angle and the pressure in which you use the bench scraper. And generally speaking, the more perpendicular your bench scraper is with the cake, the more you will be scraping off. The more parallel you are with the sides, the more you will be smoothing. And since this is a semi-naked cake, I'm essentially going to be doing 2 crumb coats on this cake. So I'm going to be scraping off quite a bit for this initial crumb coat and then finishing it off with a cleaner top coat that is just really scraped clean. Once you're satisfied with the sides, take the bench scraper and clean up the top by scraping in towards the center. Then place your crumb coated cake in the refrigerator for at least 15 to 20 minutes. You'll know that your cake is ready for its top coat when it's firm to the touch straight from the fridge. Now we're going to do the same thing that we did with the crumb coat, and I'm going to use the piping bag again because I had a little bit left over from the filling, so I'm just going to use that for the top. Go ahead and smooth that out until it's nice and flat, and then start applying some frosting to the sides. I'm using my vanilla Swiss meringue buttercream, and I will link to that video in the description box below. My Swiss meringue uses a cooked meringue because I often serve cakes to children, so I don't like to have any worries about salmonella and things like that. So I fully cook my meringue, and the buttercream is actually really smooth and airy and perfect for frosting these types of cakes. So just as with the crumb coat, we're going to smooth the frosting onto the sides of the cakes, not concerning ourselves too much with filling in the gaps between the layers. Those are already filled, but we're trying to prevent any large air bubbles for when we use the bench scraper in the next step. So by kind of smoothing the spatula on the sides of the cake, that'll prevent any gaps from forming in the sides. Alright, so now we're done with covering the cake with the second coat. We're going to have to go around with the bench scraper, and we're going to scrape more liberally than we typically would with a normal cake because this is a semi-naked cake. So we want to be able to see the dark cake layers through the frosting. Now remember how I said that the angle is going to determine the amount of scraping versus smoothing? At this part of the cake decorating, you are doing more smoothing. We've scraped a majority of the top off, so now we're just making sure that the outside is completely smooth. And once you're done with the sides, do the same thing with the top by bringing the bench scraper towards the center of the cake to remove that frosting edge. Remember to stick your cake in the fridge for at least 30 minutes more before you do any more decorating. And here it is, the finished semi-naked cake. It's really gorgeous on its own if you're going for a minimalist look, or can serve as a beautiful foundation for other types of decorating. Be sure to check out my blog, Tasty Pastry Kitchen, where I have the recipe for this chocolate cake and Swiss meringue buttercream. Thanks for watching and have a great day.